Hello, everyone. As part of the Women's Bible Study, we're going to talk about Ruth today, a story of love and loyalty. And Ruth is one of the most amazing and beautiful stories in the Bible. You find the whole book of Ruth. It's about 84 verses or something like that. Stuck between the book of Judges and 1 Samuel. So if you go into the Old Testament, you'll find the book of Ruth in there. Ruth comes as a story that lifts our hearts after the book of Judges, a period of great turmoil and a lot of disobedience, a lot of judgment that God brings upon the people of God because they are all doing what they think is right, and it's just a mess. And the book of Ruth shines in the middle of that period and gives us amazing sense of hope. The book of Ruth is a very emotional story. It's a story filled with tragedy. It's a story where three women experience the hard reality of grief and loss as they become widows. It's a story of poverty, but also a story of love and redemption, of hope and new beginnings. The story of Ruth begins with Naomi and her husband Elimelech. They live in Bethlehem. Bethlehem is known as the house of bread, as a translation of the place Bethlehem. This is where Jesus is going to be born. Ruth is if you look at Matthew chapter 1, Ruth is very much part of the genealogy of Jesus, is one of the four women mentioned in the genealogy of Jesus. Elimelech and Naomi have two sons, Mahlon and Kilion. However, they live in a period where there was such a severe famine in Israel that they take the road of becoming refugees in a little country called Moab. Now, the story of the Moabites is quite an interesting one. If you remember Noah and the big flood. Well, after the flood, Noah, in a sense, starts again. God starts again with Noah and his family. However, the tragedy of human existence is that the daughters of Noah act out of desperation, and they say, "Oh, we're not going to have any children, so let's get our father drunk and we sleep with him and we're going to have children from him." Out of that incestuous relationship between his oldest daughter and Noah comes a people called the Moabites. Now, you fast forward, and whenever Israel is coming out of Egypt, the Moabites are very much afraid of Israel, and their king called Balak engages the services of a prophet called Balaam, and he wants Balaam to go and curse them, and hopefully the people of Israel will fall under some sickness or whatever curse Balaam would bring upon the people of Israel. But God doesn't allow him. Every time Balaam tries to curse Israel, he speaks blessing because God does not allow him. And so Balaam realizes that he has no choice, and every time he tries to curse, God blesses them, and so he goes to Balak, the king, and he says, "Listen, you're not going to get anywhere because I can't curse these people, but here's what you can do to kind of destroy them. Let your women entice them. Get them to commit adultery with the men of Israel, and then God himself will punish them." And that's what they do. The Moabite women come and entice the men of Israel, the men of God. They commit adultery with them, and God punishes them. And so historically, there's been great animosity and hatred between Israel and Moab. So you can imagine that the famine must have been so severe for Elimelech and Naomi to actually go and live in Moab, because by law, the law of Moses forbade any Moabites to become part of Israel. So because of that crazy and complicated and sinful history, God said to them, stay away from Moab. So you can imagine Naomi is moving to Moab out of desperation. However, when they get to Moab, both of Naomi's sons get married, and that sort of seems again another decision out of desperation to build new lives. However, 10 years later, they live in Moab for 10 years. They seem to kind of settle there, although probably the famine has disappeared in Israel. They continue to stay in Moab. Their lives are very comfortable. However, 10 years after tragedy hits and all three men die, Naomi and Ruth and Orpah, they all become widows. So you can imagine, is it poverty, famine, desperation, a desire for new life, then tragedy hits, and Naomi gets so discouraged that he says to her daughters-in-law, please don't call me Naomi. That means pleasant. I want you to call me Mara, which means bitter. In other words, Naomi comes to a place of bitterness in life. I don't know if you've ever been there, where tragedy has hit you so many times that you've got nothing but a bitter taste in your mouth. And so Naomi decides that she's going to come back to Bethlehem with the hope to rebuild her life, regain her inheritance, her land, her house, all things that she had lost by leaving. So she decides to go back. Orpah, one of the daughters-in-law, seems to be convinced to stay in Moab. Naomi says, listen, there's no point for you to come. There's nothing great waiting for you when I go back to Israel, to Bethlehem. So why don't you both stay here? Let me just go and cry myself to an old age of poverty and desperation and bitterness, and you go and rebuild your lives, get married again, and do your thing. And Orpah seems to be convinced, but Ruth, and here's the first thing I want you to see. Ruth seems to be absolutely determined that she is going to go with Naomi, that she's not going to let her go. And here's what Ruth says to Naomi. Whenever Naomi insists, look, just go back as well. Orpah left, she went back. Why don't you, Ruth, go back? Here's what Ruth says. But Ruth replied, don't ask me to leave you and turn back. Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Wherever you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord punish me severely if I allow anything but death to separate us. Interestingly enough, this verse is often used by couples when they get married as an exchange of vows. Your place will be my place. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. And the only thing that will separate us is going to be death. She's determined to stick and be loyal to her mother-in-law. Now, I know it's hard to believe, but Ruth seems to have a great desire to stay with her mother-in-law no matter how hard things are going to be. So there is a wonderful example of determination or loyalty in Ruth at this time. The second thing that I see in Ruth, as you read the book of Ruth, you'll see that once they get to Bethlehem, there's nothing for them. The only thing they have is poverty. They have no house. They have, in a sense, no land to grow anything. So now Ruth, not only that she's a widow, but she's a Moabite. So you can understand that Ruth takes a huge risk to come to Israel, knowing the history between Israel and Moab, she takes that risk of being ridiculed by many people. And the only thing that she has is to follow Naomi's advice. So Naomi says to Ruth, I want you to go and find a field and gather the leftovers, and hopefully we'll have enough to eat and stay alive. In other words, Ruth is humbled enough to follow advice and depend on the generosity of others. There was a wonderful law in Israel that said that whenever you harvest, you must leave enough behind for those that are poor to come, gather, and have something to live on. It was by law. You were not allowed to pick everything. You had to leave stuff behind. And so it happens that the field that she goes in is the field of Boaz. There seems to be a very prosperous, rich landlord, and Boaz notices Ruth, but he's a man of honor, and he makes sure that she's treated well, that she's not abused, she's not ridiculed by the servants, by the workers in the field. And so for the first time in her life, since tragedy has hit, Ruth encounters kindness and goodness. So you can only imagine how that felt for Ruth and Naomi. You read how the story goes, and as well as we learn about Ruth, her determination and her humility, we begin to see that God begins to favor them, both Ruth and Naomi. God begins to open the door for love to be born. And that's what happens. There is a wonderful love story that develops between Boaz and Ruth. And not only that they fall in love, but also they realize that Boaz is what's called a redeemer, which means that he is a distant family relative that has the right to redeem the name of Elimelech. He's the one that is able to redeem all his inheritance, the lands and the house and everything else, by marrying Ruth. So what I love about the story of Ruth, that in the midst of this tragedy and loss and poverty, God brings these two people together, and there is, all of a sudden, there's hope. All of a sudden, there is joy. All of a sudden, there is love. All of a sudden, there is kindness. And so the story of Ruth ends up with this redemption story that is very deep rooted in love. And so a sad story of grief and pain turns into a story of love and redemption. I just love that book. So what do I learn about Ruth? Well, I learned about what it means to be loyal and determined. I learned what it means to be humble and wait on God, not doing anything rash. She could have laid herself bare at the feet of any man and say, I need to live, therefore I need to make the first move. No, she waits, allows God to put things together. And as she allows God to put things together, she encounters the blessing of what it means to have God as your Redeemer. That's why Ruth is in the genealogy of Jesus, because it reminds us of the redemptive story of Jesus coming to redeem us and give us a new inheritance, and that is eternal life in heaven. So I pray that as you read the story of Ruth, as you read the book of Ruth, as you discuss the story, you'll find the blessing of what it means to see that sadness and grief and poverty and difficulty that is turned by God into a story of love and redemption when we are determined and loyal, when we are humble, waiting on God to move, when we let Him be God. So be encouraged, and I'll see you next time.